Hi, Thomas Brinsko here, publisher of BIC Magazine and BICmagazine.com. Previously, I've discussed with you what I perceive to be the beginnings of a rebellion against ESG and green policy. I'm encouraged by recent events, and I talk about them in the upcoming January issue of BIC, but I wanted to remind you that we really have to remain vigilant in protecting our energy freedom. Much of the ESG and green policy is in pursuit of the primary goal of what was called the Paris Accord, a landmark climate agreement signed in 2015 that calls for governments to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. You'll remember Obama opted the United States into the agreement. Trump pulled us out, but then Biden put us back in. Now, proponents of this Paris Accord believe that the warming must be eliminated by the reduction of greenhouse gases, especially CO2. CO2 is now the subject of IEA's net zero goal for 2050. This net zero goal, they say, requires a transition away from fossil fuels to green forms of energy. Now, there is a logical scientific theory that growing CO2 won't necessarily have the warming effect presented by some climate experts. I'm not trying to start a fight. I recognize these words are heresy to those who claim science is settled on the matter. There's also the issue that much of the world's CO2 is not man-made. Most people say maybe 5 to 10% of it is. I'm not a scientist, but I know that most of the world's accepted science was heresy at some point. When new data and thought is presented, science is, by definition, obliged to consider it. And I recall that the science on COVID was pretty darn settled before it changed a time or two. I also believe the world's temperature has changed over time, so I'm not going to argue the point one way or another. Perhaps the Earth is warming a bit. For purposes of our discussion today, I'd gladly stipulate that, yeah, the world probably is warming a little bit. Over the last 100 years, CO2 has increased from about 0.3% of the atmosphere to 0.4%. This tiny trace compound of our air is often intentionally doubled or tripled by farmers to facilitate plant growth. We are rearranging our entire economy because CO2 levels have risen only 1/3 over 100 years. It's still less than 0.5%. For plant health, at least, CO2 levels have to come a long way up before they become harmful. And the Earth today is actually greener, containing more vegetation than it was 50 or 100 years ago. And this is attributed to the increase in CO2. Now, can a trace gas increasing marginally to a level that makes our food grow bigger and faster also be warming the world today and also be a precursor to a future environmental disaster? I don't know. Like I said, I'm not a scientist, but I do know that growing more food is a good thing. If the Earth is warming today, as our government says, because of a rise in CO2, of course, what isn't happening is catastrophic effects from that warming. Now, during the last 100 years, during this rise of CO2, the world has actually had a 98% decline in climate-related deaths. Why is this? As one of my favorite energy researchers, Alec Epstein, points out, that the benefits of fossil fuels are never taken into account by the pro-ESG and green policy movement. Fossil fuels enable us to irrigate the land and transport food. Fossil fuels allow us to master the climate with heating and cooling. If the temperature goes up a bit more in the next 100 years and we have more food, plus cheap air conditioning and central heat, is there really an existential threat because of the climate? There's actually a strong correlation that as countries industrialize and begin using much more energy, the lifespan of those countries increase. You don't have to be a trained scientist to understand cost-benefit analysis. People, I feel like, are just beginning to understand that fossil fuels actually make us far safer from the climate, besides being much more comfortable and convenient in life. But what about rising sea levels? Well, even the climate alarmists United Nations only project a 3-foot sea level rise in the next 100 years. Look, climate catastrophe predictions have been consistently wrong for the last 50 years. That's probably the subject of another blog. This prediction of sea level rise for 3 feet over 100 years, probably exaggerated as well or flat out wrong. I've lived in New Orleans. It's been below sea level for a long time. People adapt. If water levels will present a problem that far in the future, then future generations will master that just as we have mastered the drought and cold. We can live in the South and the North and be comfortable. It's really good to understand the real cost-benefit analysis of energy and CO2. But I think American public sentiment is moving away from the war on fossil fuels for a mostly pragmatic reason, their pocketbook. Cheap energy is essential to any economy. Cheap energy from fossil fuels has been a primary driver in raising the standard of living and lifespan of the entire globe. People understand intuitively that cost-effective energy is essential to an abundant, prosperous, and safe world. More energy is actually desperately needed, not just here in the United States, but by billions of people around the world. What's new is that folks are beginning to understand that fossil fuels are uniquely able to provide cost-effective energy. We need energy addition, not an energy transition. Understanding this, people are questioning if we need to wreck our economy and our power grid by lunging into an unknown future of government-directed green energy. Still, many of our politicians and unelected technocrats push the ESG and green agenda. Last month, at the United Nations Annual Climate Confab, known as COP28, the European Union's climate commissioner stated, quote, "I want COP28 to mark the beginning of the end for fossil fuels," unquote. The International Energy Agency, working off the UN's latest climate science report, says that global consumption of oil must fall 77% and natural gas 78% by 2050 for the world to hold warming to that 1.5 degree target. Now, America is not bound by what the EU, the UN, or the IEA desires, and we can vote out our own leaders who take positions with which we don't agree. It's a free country, as we like to say. Energy gives us the freedom to enjoy convenience. Energy gives us our health, our long lifespan. It gives us freedom from being controlled by our environment. We need energy freedom policies to allow development and choice of energies that will be the most beneficial for our country and the world, be it solar, wind, nuclear, geothermal, and even hydrocarbons. If you aren't already following us on LinkedIn and Twitter, please do so, and I'll see you soon.